saw some rats running from under the dead man's greatcoats. Enormous rats, fat with human flesh. My heart pounded as we edged towards one of the bodies. His helmet had rolled off. The man displayed a grimaced face, stripped of flesh, the skull bare, the eyes devoured from the yawning mouth, leapt a rat. This is a quote by a man who lived this life, who saw these sights. Can you imagine if this were your life? To really live in a trench, surrounded by rotting bodies and fighting in a war for countries that are thousands of miles away from where you call home? As a future history teacher, this is my job to get you hyped up to learn about it. The Great War is not a war that you or I hear much about, but it is a war of great destruction and despair. It is important to know what happened in this war as to understand how the future wars came to be and came to end. Territory hungry on the search for world domination, Germany set out to attack all of its neighbors and ultimately being the one to point fingers at to blame for this expensive war. Although the U.S. didn't enter the war until 1917, the U.S. gained a reputation to be reckoned with. I'm going to touch on a few main points in the war. The ultimate start of the war was the invading of Serbia. Conflicts around the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria and his wife lit a flame under Austria-Hungary and led them to attack Serbia. Germany, who stood as part of the Central Powers, vowed to defend their neighbor. Thus the Great War began in July of 1914 and lasted until November of 1918. Although these things happened long ago, they were pertinent events that ended up being part of the cause of our Second War, World War II. The only way to understand exactly how one led to the other, we must start at the beginning, which was July 28th of 1914. On that late date in July, Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria was assassinated along with his wife by a Serbian who was angry about the loss of territory. Austria-Hungary was part of the Central Powers, which also included Germany and the Ottoman Empire. Germany vowed to support Austria-Hungary in any way in its retaliation against Serbia. The invasion went as planned, and Germany helped to force their way across many lands to try to acquire more territory. The focus was then switched to ultimate power over surrounding lands and away from their original purpose. The original invasion led to the invasion of many other countries. Without going into too much detail, a fight broke out worldwide, which turned these small country battles into full-blown world war. Germany invaded Belgium, and then it began attacks on France. France, being part of the Allied powers, which included France, Britain, and Russia, called in help from Britain. Russia was brought in because the Germans had tricked Russia into thinking that Turkey attacked them, thus dragging in the Ottoman Empire. Britain continued to battle for the waterways as they were part of the huge network of trade. Worldwide trade began to suffer as many territories, especially with oceanic borders, began to lose ships to German U-boats. While the U.S. still continued to trade with both sides, they began to rely heavily on most of the Allied countries, which angered the Central Powers for making them resentful towards the U.S. Germany began setting their sights on the U.S. Our president at the time was Woodrow Wilson. He was very much against getting involved in the war. He wanted to continue trade as it was and declared neutrality. It wasn't until Germany came after the U.S. boats that things began to change. The first strike was when the Germans came off a British ocean liner called the Lusitania, carrying over 2,000 passengers. The Germans justified the blowing up of this ship because the large boat was breaking rules when it drove off course and was cruising along with no lights on. After the Germans fired a torpedo, the ship exploded, killing 1,200 passengers, and over 100 of them were American. Soon after, no boat was saved. Germany continued their resentments towards the U.S. and would seek out ships, successfully sinking quite a few of them. The second and last strike was known as the Zimmermann telegram. This was a telegram sent from Germany to Mexico and basically promised Mexico most of the U.S. southwestern territories as they would side with Germany if they would side with Germany in the war against the U.S. This telegram was the last straw, and Wilson declares war on Germany in April of 1917. The living conditions during the war, such as the sergeant earlier described, were atrocious. Men lived in trenches for years, digging them and sitting in them to try to fight enemies across vast lands, with nothing to hide behind. Men dug and dug, and some of the poorest conditions to ever be known were lived in. Men were committing suicide nightly, dying from hunger, exhaustion, and battle every second. Death tolls were piling up, and to add to these fatalities were victims of the Spanish flu pandemic. Towards the end of the war, more Americans had died from the flu than in battle. After 4 long years of battle, the war ended with the surrender of the Central Powers on November 11th of 1918. Germany was looked down upon and blamed for most of the destruction, longevity, and expense that were consequences of the war. With their hands tied and unable to use any more resources to fight, the League of Nations was formed and a treaty known as the Treaty of Versailles was signed, stripping Germany of all their military power and rearranging their territories. These restrictions angered Germany and eventually were part of the cause of World War II. World War I, as a war of great loss and World War I was a war of great loss and expense. To put into perspective, October of 2010, the final payment from Germany was sent to finish repayment of the debt that they had caused in this great war. This war was definitely not all negatives. As a huge country, the U.S. gained some and were forced into some great advancements as well as the rest of the world. If it hadn't been for this war, some of the technologies that we use in warfare today, in communication and travel, may not have never been developed or developed so quickly. Another benefit from this war was the fantastic reputation the U.S. gained in the world, especially when it pertained to naval warfare. While the Central Powers ultimately were to blame for the war, specifically Germany, this war was a pivotal event in our history. From retaliation of one country against a singular country to the addition of the world, this battle was one that at the time was the most expensive war to date. When the U.S. entered, forces were already weakened and they were able to come in strong, thus earning them a reputation. Ultimately, the League of the Nations was formed. From the terrible conditions in the trenches and the spread of the horrible disease to becoming a superpower, the Great War was a powerful time in our history. Without death, poverty, and destruction that the world experienced at the time, the U.S. would not have been the superpower that we know today. With the Great War, we earned a right to be proud to be American. Thank you.